and
See,
I'm
he's terrorist.
yes, he's
Yes.
terrorist.
Yeah. These men are
I
terrorists.
believe.
These men are terrorists. All these men are terrorists. I think you're terrorists. You come here to Afghanistan to kill people.
I don't.
Okay.
I'm not
You want to
gonna.
talk to him?
For,
David Tyson, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with David Tyson himself. Let's give us a brief background of who David Tyson is, a former senior CIA official who's seen a lot of the world.
Yeah, I grew up in Pennsylvania. My family had been there for many, many years, and had a great upbringing, a great childhood. My father worked in a paper mill, and my mother grew up on a farm. And we had a very simple lifestyle. I had a brother. I have a brother, and I just went to school and really wasn't exposed to much in the world. We were close to lived in an area that was some like a town, but also rural in a way. And I had a great childhood. I played sports. I wasn't that interested in school. Uh, and I think I just had a normal childhood for that period of time in the 60s and 70s. And as I started to get older, I was really into basketball, and I thought, like many young people do, that I could have some kind of career playing sports, but obviously those things don't really work out normally. And when I graduated high school, within 2 weeks, I joined the Army, the American Army, and became a field artilleryman. And I spent a couple years in the Army. And I got out of the Army. I went overseas to Germany and some other places. And, I enjoyed well, I don't want to say at the time I didn't enjoy my time in the Army, but it was a great experience. It was a great experience for a young man to just get out and I wanted to leave my town so much and experience things. I had no foreign language experiences until then. And, after I got out, I did some parachuting in the Army and so forth, and I met, a lot of different people and so forth. And I started to become curious in the world, so to speak. And I came back from the Army and I went back to college after I worked for a period of time in the paper mills where my dad worked. I had no interest in working for a living, so to speak. It was tough. It was tough. So I went to college, and there I started learning foreign languages. I started with Russian language. I became obsessed with the language, learning it. I loved it. And I went on to learn Uzbek in graduate school, and then Turkmen, a little bit of Farsi. And I studied in graduate school in Central Asian studies. That was my major, Russian studies, Central Asian studies, Soviet studies. This was in the 1980s.
Yeah.
And I was lucky enough to go to Uzbekistan in graduate school and spend a few years in Uzbekistan during the Soviet period learning Uzbek. And I was just obsessed with learning the language. It was so much fun, so interesting. Uh, I was so curious about everything, and it was a great experience. And I came back, did more or less the same thing with Turkmen language in Turkmenistan. And and I thought I would remain in academia. My goal was to become a professor and teach, after I learned all this stuff. And I taught for a very brief period of time as a graduate student. And then uh, it became clear that, a career in academia might not happen because, well, there's all kinds of reasons. So uh, I was approached by a CIA officer who simply was curious in my background and so forth, and she encouraged me to apply to the agency as a linguist, and that's what I did in 1990. I came into the agency in 1996 as a linguist for Russian and Uzbek and Turkmen.
it's kind of a fascinating world in the sense that how does it happen? I mean, out of kind of personal curiosity, how does it happen? Like, yeah, let's do they have a kind of a headhunting system that they look at? Yeah, let's have a chat with David Tyson.
As far as I know, the formal headhunting system, like many corporations have or businesses have, I don't think the agency does that exactly. Back in the early days, perhaps, right? It was word of mouth, who you know, and so forth. But as the years went on, and I think currently, they basically advertise and have job fairs, and of course, there's websites and there's the reputation, and people simply apply.
Hmm.
Now, I didn't do that, and you pointed that out, but I think the bulk of CIA officers come via the normal application process, which is, I would say, somewhat mundane. It's simply you go to a website and you follow the instructions and you apply. But with me, I was encouraged to apply,
Hmm.
meaning I still had to do all that stuff. However, a CIA officer who was who who apparently was aware of, you know, I went to Indiana University and aware of people who were studying exotic languages, to include Russian, which is not exotic. But what I understand, these officers were aware of people like myself, and depending on how much time they had and their interest, they would actually approach us and simply talk to us and ask us, what's going on, and uh, they're not necessarily recruiters, but they're just being good CIA officers. And just like me, when I find somebody that I know or hear about in the past, maybe, I could encourage them to apply. So that's what ha happened in my case. And I don't think my application was given any more weight, positive weight, because of this officer, but she simply exposed me, so to speak, to the agency and what it does.
Hmm.
Until that time, I really had no interest or knowledge about the agency. I was not one of these people that sort of followed it or was interested in espionage or the activities of the agency. I was very apolitical. I was not interested in politics. I kind of equated the agency with government and
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
politics.
yeah, yeah.
And of course, there was a James Bond, what do you call it, phenomenon out
Yes,
there
yeah.
in the 70s and 80s and so forth and 90s. And I had no interest in whatsoever in that kind of thing, where you wear a suit and tie and go to cocktail parties and stuff like that. That was the last thing that I was interested in. I was interested in going out, talking to people that were interesting to me, and learning about their life and culture and so forth. I was doing at the time in graduate school shrine pilgrimage. You're probably aware of,
Yeah.
you know, ziyarat and stuff like
Yes,
this, going
yes, yeah,
to
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Sufi shrines, and that was sort of my interest. And I did that in Central Asia. I went around to shrines. I had a great a number of professors in Indiana that were studying that or knew about those things. So I was sort of encouraged to go that route, and I went that route, spending a lot of time. So what I'm getting at is, when I went to Central Asia, my job as a scholar, a student, was to go find and learn about things that I was interested in to write in order to write my dissertation and papers and so forth. So you go out and you basically target somebody,
Yeah.
and you go talk to him and you try to get information from him or her. And that's generally, in a way, what a CIA officer does,
Yeah.
operations officer. He is sort of, he knows who to go after, who to pursue, and establish a relationship and get information. And I had been doing that as a young scholar for many, many years. And so that's what it turns out the agency for me was about. It was not necessarily going to the cocktail
So
party.
the modus operandi didn't change, but it's only that you were getting paid for it now.
Yeah, and of course, I was not doing shrine pilgrimage anymore, right? I had different uh, interests that I was,
Yeah.
asked to go after, and my career was spent only in Central Asia, South Asia, the Caucasus.
Yeah.
I did not go to Europe to work. I did not go to Asia to work per se. I went to the countries in which I had the language and so forth, and that was very good. I mean that's a definite advantage when you speak the language in the country you are in,
Mm.
or one of the languages. So for me, my agency career was spent in that part of the world and doing those kind of things, which was, something that I had sort of trained for unwittingly as a student.
When did Afghanistan begin to overlap into your working
Well, almost
environment?
immediately. Uh, I was posted first overseas in 1998, and at that time, Afghanistan, as you probably know, in terms of, American interest, was only starting to become an object of interest to
But
the
can you
to the
say this 1998 where was, or you
Yeah,
cannot?
I was in Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and so
Okay.
forth,
Okay.
in that part of the world. Yeah. And these are, I don't know what, the perception is, but the agency is a very small organization compared to other organizations. And we have small numbers of people in places. Uh, and sometimes in some places we have nobody at all, right? We're not everywhere all the time, right? So uh, in 1998, historically, that Afghanistan, we had the jihad, the so-called jihad, where the United States supported the Afghan mujahideen against the Soviets.
Yeah.
That was in the 1980s, essentially, and the United States poured in support, mostly, financial and in terms of weaponry and so forth, to the mujahideen to fight the Soviets. And after that war was won, so to speak, after the Soviets left, the United States, uh, the interest in Afghanistan basically went back to zero again.
Yeah.
And the Afghans were left to their own devices, so to speak, with, of course, the influence of, other regional powers. But there was a civil war in the 1990s, as you know, and a lot of blood was shed. There was a lot of fighting. And in I forget which year exactly, 96, 97, Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden relocated essentially to Afghanistan after after being created,
Yeah.
and it conducted bombings in the U.S. embassies in Africa, two of them.
Yeah.
And
Kenya and Tanzania.
yes, yes, and with that, there was started the agency and the U.S. government started to become interested in Afghanistan again, simply because of the presence of Al-Qaeda inside Afghanistan and their sort of alliance with the Taliban. There had been interest as well before that, oil and gas and pipelines and so forth. But in terms of agency efforts, we only got interested in Afghanistan again in a big way when Al-Qaeda became an issue. And in those early days, in the late 1990s, the agency started to seek out Afghans who could provide information about Al-Qaeda and just the lay of the land, so to speak. So that was one of my first sort of jobs was to acquaint myself with Afghans and try to understand the basics about the country in terms of who was who and which warlords were on which side and the nature of the Taliban, the nature of Al Qaeda, and so forth. And that was how I gained sort of entree into the Afghanistan issue with
So
that.
the focus on Afghanistan from the CIA's point of view was mainly focused on tracking down Osama bin Laden, basically.
Yes, and monitoring him and trying to find potential partners in Afghanistan, the warlord, so-called warlords,
Hmm.
who would help us monitor him and, potentially, depending on the situation, to help us take action against Al-Qaeda if that need ever arose.
And at the same time, the Taliban were making heavy inroads in northern Afghanistan. 1998, they managed to capture Mazar-i-Sharif, and then there were the massacres of the Hazaras and others in Mazar-i-Sharif, and then Bamyan and Yakaling and elsewhere that followed. How much of an awareness was of the events, or how much of interest were those events to you guys, at CIA stations in Central Asia?
Well, I would say it was growing. Now, you're talking a CIA presence that was small, right? You have a
Hmm.
small presence. Well, you have a presence in Pakistan. You have a presence in Central Asia. We're talking very small numbers of people who are from their own places, locations, trying to get a feel for Afghanistan again from their lens. If you're in Pakistan, you're probably dealing more with Pashtuns, right?
Yeah.
And understanding the Taliban from the Pashtun side of things. And if you're in Central Asia, in Uzbekistan or Tajikistan or Turkmenistan or wherever, you're understanding it via the sources, the contacts you have who are there, who are probably not Pashtun.
Yeah.
They're Tajiks from Jamiat, Uzbeks from Jumbesh, and so forth and so on, Hazaras from Hizbi Wadad or whatever. And so all that information is sort of sent back to headquarters, and you have the analysts and other people there who come up with a picture of Afghanistan at the time from a vantage point from counterterrorism, from a vantage point of just, what's going on politically, who's who in the warlords. So to answer your question, certainly the agency was aware, as was the world, human rights organizations and so forth, about what was taking place inside Afghanistan in terms of the Taliban excesses and so forth. However, the agency's interests were fairly narrow. They were
Hmm.
focused more on, counter-terrorist issues and Al-Qaeda, and not so much on the Taliban. We did not have the mandate from the administration to, the Taliban was not the United States enemy at the time,
Yeah.
simply because, the United States was not taking a role inside Afghanistan in terms of overall politics and so forth.
So, how were your relationships with these commanders? How would you prioritize who to focus on and who to just let go? You're a busted flush, as they would say in Britain.
Well, I think the process is it's sort of there's some natural processes that go on. Someone like me who's in contact with commanders or political figures in Jamiat, Wada, the Hazaras, the Tajiks, and the Uzbeks, and they're part of this so-called Northern Alliance at the time in the late 1990s. And so you establish relationships with these people, and naturally in some cases, at least in my case, there's an affinity that's created. You hear their stories, they tell you about their struggles, they tell you about their needs, and of course they tell you about the terrible Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, right? So you begin to sort of support, at least personally, their agendas to a
Yeah.
degree, right? And that information, without the sort of personalization, it goes back to headquarters too. And of course, headquarters understands that some guys in some stations are wanting us to support the effort. But
Yeah.
again, the administration, the mandate from the administration dictates generally what we can support in terms of political movements, right?
Yeah.
And military movements. again, we have a very narrow focus on al-Qaeda. And if these warlords are able to help us in that regard, then we will support them only as far as it allows in terms of having them help us to get the information or whatever we need in terms of al-Qaeda. So certainly by the late 1990s, there was a clear awareness that the Taliban and al-Qaeda was taking over Afghanistan. 95 to, more percent of the country territorially was, controlled by the Taliban. And, uh, and it was clear to the United States government and the agency and so forth, the intelligence community, that al-Qaeda was a bad actor.
Yeah.
And so the support that was, at least on a certain level, for the Northern Alliance was growing. And our efforts to help those warlords who were fighting al-Qaeda and the Taliban also grew. But this is small
Yeah.
potatoes, we say, because we had no overall mandate from the government to say, get involved in this and we need to overthrow the Taliban and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, were these kind of offer of support or building of those relationships hierarchical, or was it just on individual per individual basis?
I would say it's based on the individuals and in our assessment of what they could do for us.
Yeah.
Ahmad Shah Massoud at the time was a well-known force in part of Afghanistan, the Panjshir Valley and so forth. He had men under arms, he had capabilities, intelligence capabilities and so forth, and he had all of these men had their own sort of intelligence services, if you will.
Yeah.
And so we were trying to use those assets that they had to help us gain information and other, things, data and so
Yeah.
forth that would help us. So our support was sort of commensurate with those assessments. And they involved, equipment, radio equipment, intelligence gathering stuff and
Money.
some money. Yeah, but
Yeah.
not weapons.
Hmm.
And this was much less than they wanted, of course.
Yeah.
And and you had U.S. congressmen who were, pushing in Congress for more support and, the normal politics things.
Yeah.
You're familiar with the Charlie Wilson's
Yes.
war.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wasn't part of that, or that was before my time, so to speak, but that's how the stuff happens back in Washington, and the end product is the support
Yeah.
that comes from the agency and from other U.S. government uh, entities.
And you made trips to Massoud's bases. So talk about those trips.
Well, these were very sort of exploratory efforts on the part of the agency to go into northern Afghanistan and actually meet with leaders. And that started in the very late 1990s, I believe. There's a good book out there by Steve Call.
Yeah.
Uh, Gosh, I forget the name. I'm
Yeah.
sure
Yeah.
you.
Is it Directorate S? And
No,
then
it's
there is
before that. The one
Ghost War.
before. Ghost Wars. Yes, I think Steve. That book is well done, very well researched, as far as I can tell. And he sort of outlined some of those efforts. And these were very small efforts to get U.S. Agency officers in direct contact with Massoud
Yeah.
and some of his intelligence officers in order to, understand things, right? And
Yeah.
understand what he needs, what his capabilities are. And so these meetings took place in different parts of the Panjshir and I believe in Tajikistan as well.
There's a photo of you um, sitting and taking notes during a meeting with Massoud. There's a colleague of you sitting on your right. Set the scene for us of, your first encounter with Massoud and the preconceptions, of course, that you had about him, but set the scene for, that meeting and those kind of encounters.
Sure. Now, I want to stress that I was not a leader of the team. I was
Yeah.
just a guy, right? One of the guys. I spoke a little bit of Farsi and, I knew Afghanistan to a degree. I'd been gathering information from different sources about Massoud, and we had relationships with his people in different countries. Massoud, he had people, I don't want to say all over the world, but certain parts of the world, he had representatives to
Hmm.
include, I believe, the UK at the time. So the interesting thing, for me, this was my first trip into Afghanistan. And we flew in on one of Massoud's helicopters, Mi-8 helicopters, a Soviet-built helicopter, and piloted by his pilots.
And it would take
His
place from Tajikistan rather than Uzbek.
Tajikistan, right? He had a good relationship with the Tajik government, and so we flew into the Panjshir from Tajikistan, and it was a great, an adventure, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the helicopter was not in good shape.
Mhm.
It stunk of fuel. There was leakages all over the place, and we got over the pass. I forget. It was at Hawak Pass or Anjuman. I forget which pass it was. And of course, the pilot says, we only could take so many people and so much weight, and the problems with the lift and the height, the altitude and everything. So there was all these sort of specters of, crashing and so
Yeah.
forth. So
Yeah.
it was a great adventure for us, a group of Americans to go, just the movement itself into Afghanistan. And we flew over areas that were devastated by the Taliban in Badakhshan province and so forth, to see the burnout villages. And it was obviously pointed out to us that, these villages had been destroyed by the Taliban and so forth. So we land, and this small group, I think it was 4, 5, 6 guys, we try to set up communications, and we start our relationship meeting Massoud. Now, Massoud was a well-known figure. He had been
Yeah.
written about since the Mujahideen period. He was considered a cultured, almost intellectual type, charismatic figure for the Panjshiris, for the Tajiks. And that's, very thoughtful. And that's exactly who he turned out to be. I think the intelligence on him, it was not so much intelligence, but the information that was out there about Massoud was more or less, you know, to us, it turned out to be correct. And in terms of his sort of biography, his demeanor, his way of doing things, and his interests. It was very clear what he was interested in. And I think the relationship was a very positive one because we believed it to be straightforward generally. I mean, the interests were straightforward.
Yeah.
Uh, there was, as we say, when the rubber hits the roads, things get more complicated. But on that level, on a leader to leader level or on the leadership level, he was a very straightforward and good partner in that
Yeah.
regard.
What were his asks in that meeting or the meetings that you
Well, of
had?
course, he wanted more than, this is normally the case. He's fighting a war for survival.
Yeah.
He is creating alliances with different people, the Uzbeks, the Hazars, and so forth. People that he had been fighting, only years ago in the Civil War,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Yeah.
But his interests were very straightforward. I need money, I need equipment, I need ammunition, and I need your government to support us in a big way. Because if you don't, Afghanistan is going to be taken over by these people, and Al-Qaeda will have this base here, and they'll continue their work and terrorist activities. So of course, from a narrow perspective, my perspective, and I think from an agency perspective, that it was clear that we should get ahead of this game, so
Yeah.
to speak, and support him in in ways that we can verify and uh, in appropriate ways. Uh, and I think the effort there began from the agency through the sort of chain of command to let the administration know
Yeah.
that this was a good partner who we should start with.
And how were the feedbacks that you're getting from, your civilian leaders?
Yeah, I think, that's a little bit out of my league because I wasn't, I was focused on the ground and so forth, but it was a very cautious one at the time. This is the late 1990s. There was there was really no appetite or interest to start or to become enmeshed into another conflict in Afghanistan. I think, not that these are equated, but the Somali, the Mogadishu problems, Black
Yeah,
Hawk
yeah,
Down
yeah,
and
yeah,
all that.
yeah,
That
yeah,
was, and nobody was calling for U.S. troops. But this idea to get slowly involved into somebody else's war was, something of a cautionary tale.
yeah,
There was the legacy of Vietnam and so forth. But again, we were not asking for that. But this is the way how things get started,
yeah,
right? Uh, and our I think what the agency maintained was this is a little bit different because we have a known terrorist who has known capabilities, who is knowingly or wittingly, telling us what he's going to do to us or try
yeah,
to do to us. He declared war on us essentially.
yeah,
And that was becoming clear, and people were waking up to that in the United States. So this was all coming to a head, so to speak,
yeah,
in 2000, 2001. And obviously 9/11 happened and changed everything.
yeah.
But, things were going slowly in 2000 and 2001 up until 9/11.
Massoud was losing ground, right? And he was not making progress on the positive way. And were the US government prepared for the entirety of Afghanistan to fall into the hands of the Taliban?
That's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that. I know the support was ramping up before his death on 9/9,
Yeah,
9 September. Uh, would, I think it a little bit unlikely that in the immediate future that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda would take over the whole of Afghanistan because there was, Dostum had returned to Afghanistan, I believe, in April of 2001
yeah.
in mostly in Hazara areas
Yes, and
in the
there is.
mountains. And yes, in Balkhab and things
Yeah,
like that.
yeah,
Place, I mean, so he had created another front. Uh, well, I mean, this is all conjecture. I do know that and he was suffering losses. It's not like he came in and started winning the war. No,
yeah,
that's not the case. All my belief, the Taliban was a strong force, but it was not going to suddenly eat everything up in Afghanistan and take over the country in the next couple months. Perhaps, in the course of the year, 2002 or something, it would. But I don't know what the U.S. was prepared to do. I think it was all based on the perceived or threat understood from Al Qaeda. And I think by 2001, especially in the early to mid part of the year in 2001, there were plenty of indicators uh, out there that were giving the U.S. government a great deal of concern about Al Qaeda threats and so forth, what Al Qaeda was doing or trying to do. So I have no way to know what would have transpired had Massoud or had 9/11 not happened. But I do know that our efforts with Massoud were likely to increase uh, no matter what. And would it staved off the Taliban victory? I don't know. Perhaps not. But I don't think there was a fundamental change in the U.S. government's position vis-a-vis Afghanistan before 9/11.
yeah.
There may have been a change vis-a-vis in terms of Al Qaeda, and that may have been the vehicle for us to, support Massoud in a very big way, and the others who were part of the Northern Alliance.